All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the May 2023 edition of our Learning Our Landscape presentation series, a partnership with the North Olympic History Center and the Jamestown S'Klallam Tribal Library. The North Olympic History Center acknowledges that we do our work on the lands of the first peoples of this area, the S'Klallam, ŋxʷən, Paiute, and Hoh River tribes. We recognize the rich and important history of the tribal nations in S'Klallam County and commit our work to this tribal land acknowledgement, to work together collectively to help preserve and share their histories. Thank you all for joining us today. As always, we are going to have this presentation recorded, and then Brandon will have it posted up on the Jamestown Tribal Library's YouTube page in a week or two. Please save your questions for the end or type them into the chat box at the bottom, and we'll save time at the end of the presentation to get to those. And so without further ado, I'd like to welcome Robert Knapp, who's the Jamestown S'Klallam Tribe's Environmental Planning Program Manager, who's going to talk about all of the different changes that have occurred on this landscape over time and all of the work that the Jamestown Tribe is doing to address those changes and sort of get us ahead of the curve, if you will. So Robert, take it away.
Thank you. Share my screen. I'm going to turn off my camera to preserve bandwidth. Also, figure out how to do that now that Well, thanks everyone for letting me present today. I am, as David said, I'm Robert Knapp, Environmental Planning Manager for the Natural Resource Department at the Jamestown S'Klallam Tribe. And I've been with the Jamestown Tribe for 10 years now. And I just thought I'd talk a little bit about all the interesting things I've been able to do in my life, because it maybe provide some insights into the broad topics I'm about to cover. So I went to school to be an environmental scientist. In recent years, I've worked in restoration. I've mostly done a lot of planning and worked for governments. I was a wildlife researcher. I've had some other brief jobs in stormwater monitoring, processing salmon in Alaska. I installed a couple solar systems and was an electrician for a long time. I was a math tutor. I got paid to wander the Elwha looking for otter scat. I am going to talk about some things that are pretty well defined and some things that are not so well defined, and any opinions here are my own. So the Jamestown S'Klallam Tribe's Natural Resource Department, our mission is to protect and enhance the treaty resources of the tribe. And kind of the iconic ones are salmon and shellfish. And that's where a lot of our efforts are focused. It's we also spend time on dealing with habitat loss, water quality, and a lot of other issues. Increasingly over time, we've noticed that the changes in our climate are adding to or complicating a lot of the issues we were already facing. Here are some other natural resources that are also important to the tribe, with cedar being one of the main ones. Traditionally, a lot of these materials would have been used for food or fiber or building materials for the tribe. And some of these things are having a harder time as our climate has shifted. We're starting to see cedars dying back and some other impacts. We're also concerned about and seeing evidence of sea level rise. And that's another issue that we are working to address and to adapt to. The tribe is actively planning for and moving some of its infrastructure away from the shoreline, and has worked on restoration projects that also either moved or made more resilient infrastructure in the process of also restoring habitat. One recent event that folks will probably remember that had a pretty profound effect that we're still learning more about was the record high temperatures that coincided with a low tide. It would have been unfortunate if we'd had those record high temperatures anytime, but the fact that they occurred at a low tide caused some impacts to shellfish. We're learning more and more about that, and it probably could have been even worse. Also, at least partly due to changes in our climate, the tribe raises oysters in Kona, Hawaii, and Hawaii turns out to be a good place to grow algae, which is what feed the oysters. So it's not the only reason that we have a shellfish nursery in Hawaii, but it is one of the reasons. And we also have concerns about other shellfish in Puget Sound and the implications of the changing chemistry of our marine waters and what those changes might mean for future harvest of things like Dungeness crab and other shellfish. So with that little introduction to tribal stuff, I'll launch into some of my thoughts and some of my thoughts for today. When I was thinking about preparing for this presentation, I was thinking back to some of the previous presentations in this Learning Our Landscape series, and I've really enjoyed hearing the things that people have learned about this area and about the history and the prehistory of the area and the landscapes. And I was thinking about, well, what can I offer to this? And I spent my whole life exploring and learning about landscapes, and I've lived mostly in the Northwest, so most of my time was spent in forested coastal areas, but I've been fascinated by the changes, and in recent years, as I mentioned, had a chance to work in restoration and to work to try to figure out how to make our landscapes more supportive to the species that were once in great abundance here, and especially surrounding recovery of salmon. So in preparing this presentation, I started to think, well, if I step back and think what things have had a big influence on our landscapes, and what do I know about those things, or what can I learn about those things that might be interesting to you? So I started out by thinking about the really big things, the big physical, chemical, and biological processes that created and formed our landscape, and then kind of worked my way down to how biology impacts landscapes, and to some more local and more recent changes in our landscapes. So somewhere in here, there's a thread that ties these topics together, and I hope that thread isn't just in my mind, and that this will make some sense to you as I go through it. And David already said this, but I know you'll have questions. I've I have questions even about the things I researched, but I'll be happy to answer those at the end. So here we go. So probably the biggest changes to our landscape have to do with the formation and movement of the continents themselves. And I had seen some of these graphics, like this one, showing the movements of the continents around, but there are some really great ones now that are out there that, if you get a chance, I encourage you to look for these. Just as a note, I am not going to talk about the astrophysical processes that influence our planet, just for the sake of time. But this particular graphic, just for a sense of scale, covers the last 150 million years. And I'm sure there's a lot of uncertainty in it. And just for reference, on this time frame, the formation of the Olympics and Olympic Mountains and the Olympic Peninsula would have been very, very recent, and just kind of a blip on here. Another fairly dramatic landscape change event that's more recent would have been the glaciation. This graphic was created by the Burke Museum, shows the most recent glacial advance into Puget Sound and then retreat. It also shows the impacts of the weight of the glaciers on relative sea level. And this is part of a longer loop that you can find online that also covers Mount Rainier erupting and some other things. I find this very fascinating, especially the part about sea level rise, but I'm not going to talk too much about that today. The Burke Museum also created this graphic that just gives you a sense of scale of the amount of ice that was here, with the Space Needle on the left side of the graphic. It's kind of hard to fathom the amount of weight that was here, and so much weight that it pushed down the earth, and we are still rebounding, although much slower now than right after the glaciers left. I alluded to the fact that this is just the most recent glacial advance and retreat. So I was curious about how many times that had happened. And it turns out that there's evidence of at least 7 different advances of the Canadian ice sheet into Puget Sound over the last 2.5 million years ago. And technically speaking, we're still in an ice age. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So when I started researching for this, I really wanted to learn more about the relationship between sort of average global temperatures and temperature extremes. But it turned out that that was a rabbit hole that was way too deep for the amount of time I had. So for the purposes of the next few slides, I'm going to be just talking about global average temperatures and focusing more on climate than weather, where and this slide talks a little bit about the differences between climate and weather. I'll also note that I borrowed quite a few of the graphics, and they change in units fairly frequently. Some of them are in degrees Celsius. I did not have the time or energy to convert them to Fahrenheit, but I will try to call out the units in the graphics. So talking about those more recent glaciations, this is a graphic that shows global temperature in degrees Celsius over the last 500,000 years. And when you're talking about global average temperatures, it's kind of amazing how little difference there is between the interglacial warm periods and the times when ice was advancing. The little snowflakes or stars at the bottom are represent the times when there was sort of glacial extents down farther into North America and to the US. These are various graphics where they attempt to sort of depict the extent of the glaciers during the last, or during this, the maximum of the current glaciation. And I don't know which one is the best representation, but I think they're both rather interesting. This glaciation is called the Wisconsin glaciation, at least if you're out east, because it got down south of the Wisconsin area that we currently call Wisconsin in Puget Sound. It might also be called the Vashon glaciation. So while this was very interesting to me, my curiosity was not completely satisfied, so I kept digging in to glacial periods and went a little farther back. So this little graphic shows the last 4.6 billion years in millions of years across the top, and the blue or teal boxes show the various times when there were sort of major glacial periods in our planet's history. There's been 6 glacial periods that we've been able to determine, and I took a little dive into the very first one because I find that one fascinating. So this is what temperatures have looked like over the last 500 million years. And I like this graphic because the line through between, and this is in Fahrenheit, sorry for the change in units, but the line that's at around 68-ish degrees Fahrenheit for global average temperature is roughly the line between where you would have polar ice caps or not polar ice caps. But again, the difference between the warmest periods on this graph and the lowest period, when you average that across the globe and squash it down to millions of years, it's really not that big a difference. And I'll note that, you know, where it points to today, you know, on this time scale, that really compresses a lot of variation out of it. And I saw this headline not too long ago that asked, was it much hotter or much colder in the past? And I guess I can say that we're very certain that it has been quite a bit hotter and quite a bit colder than it is now. And it's interesting to note that the temperature differences between those recent glacial periods are very small. So it doesn't take very much to make profound changes in the climate. This is a zoomed in of that same graphic I showed previously, and I just wanted to show it up close and mention again that I wanted to know a little bit more about what caused the first major glacial period, which is called the Huronian glaciation, I think, and that's named after Lake Huron, where they find some of the older portions of the continent and find evidence along Lake Huron in Ontario, Canada, of that ice event and the period leading up to it. So what can cause that kind of an ice event? And one of the things that can cause that is change in the makeup or chemistry of our atmosphere. And in this graph, the center of the graph where oxygen goes way up and methane goes way down corresponds with that first major glacial period that I previously showed. And this is sometimes referred to as the great oxygenation event. And so what caused the oxygen? And you can see on this slide that there is evidence of life before we see the spike in oxygen. But it took a while, a couple billion years, 1.5 billion years before the oxygen spikes up and we have the great oxygenation event. Just as a note, oxygen can and probably was created in the atmosphere by sunlight, but it would have likely reacted with the methane in the atmosphere pretty quickly. And sunlight doesn't create huge amounts of oxygen, apparently. But what happened is that small life forms started figuring out how to make more and more oxygen. And kind of the star of that show is cyanobacteria. And they managed to hang around and survive on a pretty hostile time in our Earth's history and keep creating oxygen until the oxygen was able to use up all the methane, and I think there was a lot of stuff happening in the chemistry of the ocean also that had to be overcome before the oxygen could build up. It's also important to know on this graph that this is only like 10% here, so we're not talking about a lot. These pie charts at the bottom also ignore nitrogen, which is an interesting part of the story, but not critical to this little bit of the story that we're focused on. So as cyanobacteria created enough oxygen and reduced the methane in the atmosphere, methane is a really strong greenhouse gas and oxygen is not. And so it is a common theory that the great oxygenation event was what caused the Earth to cool. We had less greenhouse gases, more oxygen, and so things cooled down enough to create that very first major glaciation. Oxygen also plays an important role in the atmosphere in creating ozone, which prevents us from getting the full effect of UV radiation. So a lot of what the life we see on Earth is probably only able to exist in this form thanks to cyanobacteria. So they had a really big impact on and created a lot of interesting geology and changes in the chemistry of our oceans and our atmosphere. And so I just asked the question, rhetorical question, I guess, is cyanobacteria the most successful keystone species? And what, well, and for starters, cyanobacteria are a whole group of species, not just one, but some of you might be asking, what is a keystone species? And with that question, I'm going to transition from talking about millions of years and things long ago to more recent changes in the landscape. So I found this great graphic that tells what a keystone is to people who create archways, and then relates that to keystone species. And this example, the keystone species depicted is sea otters, where the sea otter eats the sea urchin, which keeps the sea urchin population from growing and overgrazing the kelp. There are many other keystone species, and they can have very profound effects on ecosystems and on how our landscapes look to us, which is why I wanted to explore that a little bit more. I'll mention that the keystone species hypothesis does not have universal support. And I would agree with folks that say that it oversimplifies the complex relationships in ecosystems. But I do think that there are some species who have a greater influence over ecosystems than others. People who study keystone species, and I think you could spend your whole career just studying one keystone species, but they have attempted to kind of group the keystone species into different groups, and including predators, modifiers, prey, mutualists, and hosts. And I'll give a few examples of those. I was fortunate enough to study the habitats of beavers, and I've been fascinated by beavers. So this I call my obligatory beaver slide, but it does sort of fit in with this because beavers are one of the keystone species that are often brought up because of their ability to modify the landscape in sometimes very big ways, and to create habitats that might otherwise not exist or exist in such quantity. As I mentioned, I was blessed to spend part of my career in both the Elwha and Dungeness valleys, in and around rivers. And while I was doing all of that, I spent quite a bit of time looking at the way the landscape is now and trying to imagine what that landscape looked like before. Were there a lot more beavers on the Olympic Peninsula? There were definitely a lot more beavers in North America than there are now. I'm not sure that the Olympic Peninsula is the best beaver habitat in the world, but there definitely are beavers here, and they definitely are trying to do their thing. They just have the misfortune of often wanting to live in the same places that humans like to live, and we find ourselves in conflict often. So as I looked around at our landscapes, you start to see evidence that the landscapes we see now, while sometimes very beautiful, are likely quite different than they were in the past, with the possible exception of places in our national parks. We've cleared forests. Even in places in the park, you'll see stumps where the trees were removed, and we've removed beavers. We've removed wolves from the picture. Many of those things have some impact on the way our landscapes function now and the way they look. We've also lost some plants and added some plants over time. And part of my work is involved in trying to bring animals back into the landscapes and trying to push back the more recent species that may be causing our landscapes issues. So I'll just briefly mention invasive species because I noticed that the definition of invasive species and keystone species had kind of a lot in common. Pictures of a European green crab, and the tribe is actively working with many partners to control European green crab as it has moved into the Puget Sound, Salish Sea area. Both keystone species and invasive species are said to have wide-ranging effects on the ecosystem and the landscape. And I would say a key difference between those is often that keystone species help support diversity in the ecosystem, whereas invasive species tend to be really good at outcompeting other species and reducing diversity. One of the other things that I spent a lot of time thinking about in our landscape is the impact of large trees. We're fortunate to live in an area that grows very large trees, and we have places we can go and hike through these very large trees. But when you get closer to our developed areas, many of those large trees have been removed, and the impacts of that removal has impacted many species in the way we interact and the way our streams function. So I propose the question: are large trees a keystone element of Pacific Northwest river valleys, and is large wood in one of the key factors for maintaining healthy rivers? And my answer to that is yes. Large wood is plays an important role in our ecosystem and maintaining healthy rivers and healthy salmon populations. And we've removed most of the floodplain forests from along our rivers, and we sort of actively removed the wood from the streams, which caused our gravel bed rivers to kind of become unraveled and to behave very differently. And so even when we see a very beautiful, idyllic picture of the river, it may not be all that it's meant to be. So what are some of the other changes that our development has had on the landscape? This is kind of an extreme case, but as I mentioned, we've removed the forest and vegetation from a lot of our landscape through clearing. We've regraded, we've flattened for building sites and roads, and all of that activity is critical to the way we get around. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how those changes impact how water interacts with our landscapes. I suspect many of you have seen graphics similar to this that and are familiar with how undeveloped landscapes work, where the precipitation is able to interact with the vegetation and be absorbed by the vegetation, or captured by the vegetation, soils, and landscape, and infiltrated into groundwater and shallow water flows, and eventually into our streams. And as we develop, the farther you go from forested on this scale towards urban, the more that you see changes in the way water interacts with our landscapes. This graphic doesn't show just the forested scenario, but it does show that as we move from rural to urban, we start to change the way how much water is able to get into the soils and into the ground, and how quickly it runs off of the landscapes. And I think the key point is that the more hard surfaces we make and the more changes we make to the landscape, the less the water stays on the landscape, which has unfortunate consequences. Here's another graphic of kind of the same thing that shows, evaporation, evapotranspiration, and runoff and infiltration. And basically, the more hard surfaces we put out there, the less water that can get into the ground, and actually the less that often evaporates as well. So more and more of it is trapped on our hard surfaces and trying to find a way downhill. All these things that I've talked about recently about changes in our landscapes are often lumped under the heading hydromodification, or another way of saying is just the modification of the movement of water. And I spent, as I mentioned, some time working in stormwater and thinking about it and water quality, and this has impacts to both how the water moves, but what it carries with it. And I thought about calling this part of the talk, "You should dig a hole in your yard," but I thought your spouses might not like that if I said that to you. So here's some more. Here's another graphic that I found interesting, where they're letting people know that, just the act of collecting water on your roof and letting it go into the streets or your yard or the storm drain has impacts. My neighbor's basement floods, and the more my neighborhood changes and grows, the more water that accumulates in ditches and in my neighbor's basement. And it can be an issue for road departments, water quality, keeping our beaches open, health of our ecosystems, and a lot of other things. Here are a few photos that I found while I was researching this that I found kind of amusing. I think these were someone's front steps with water sort of cascading down them. More water on the sidewalks. So this was a interesting headline that I found. I had been trying to figure out what people call this other than hydromodification, and I liked this where they called it replumbing of our watersheds. And for many years, I'd been watching all these small changes. My neighbor's yard would puddle up with water, so he redirected the water to the county ditch. If enough people do that, then the culvert down the street from me will have to be made larger or will wash out. So there's just these cumulative impacts where one small change leads to more cumulative impacts. And I started calling this watershed simplification, but I couldn't really find too many other people who were using that term. But here's a graphic that kind of gets at that, what I've been talking about, where roads intercept water and channel them into ditches. Sometimes we build pipes to try to move the water. Sometimes we build canals. And from an engineering standpoint, all of that is to efficiently move the water away from the landscape. And sometimes we've done this so either intentionally or unintentionally, so that water will move from one watershed to a different watershed. But all of this extra efficiency in engineering terms has costs, as we will see a little bit more. But in general, I would say we need to work to try to retain the water on our landscapes more. So what happens when we efficiently get this water to our rivers and streams? And this is kind of a very bright and loud graphic, but it was one that I could find just to kind of give a cartoonish vision of what rivers might have in the way of starting in the mountains and moving down into the deltas, into the sea, with floodplains and rapids and tributaries and meanders, all that stuff. So as I mentioned, I grew up in the Northwest. I spent my youth wandering around in forests that look a lot like this, playing in streams, climbing over mossy covered logs in the Oregon Coast Range. And there was a lot of logging in that area, so you would see big changes when logging would happen. But I really didn't know what I was looking at, whether what I was looking at would have been the same 500 years before, or whether it would have been very different. And you don't have to go to Oregon to see streams like this. You can just go up in the mountains and find places that are very much like this. But many rivers and streams don't look like this. Some of them look more like this. And I found this image. I probably could have found image like this that I'd taken myself, but I wanted to just see what would come up if I searched scenic rivers on Google. And this was an image that came up. And this is apparently someplace in Utah, but it doesn't look that much different than many places on the Dungeness River, other local rivers. And after spending as much time as I have looking at and thinking about rivers and hanging out with people who are trying to restore rivers, when I see this, I see a very different thing than what many people would see when they think of a scenic river or a river like this. And mainly what I see is a river that does not have very much complexity in it, that's missing a lot of its structure. And part of how that manifests itself is in long, straight stretches of river that are all sort of rapids like this. There's a lot of big boulders and a lot of cobble, very little smaller particles, smaller gravels, sands and silts, the kind of things that salmon need to spawn. There can be long stretches like this without any pools, which are beneficial to salmon and many other individuals too. So this kind of a scene is largely created by our removal of wood and other structural elements from especially really big down wood and log jams. But there are other things that can cause rivers to be unhealthy, including the fact that we used to spend quite a bit of time moving rivers to the sides of valleys, straightening them out. Like I said, that sort of engineering mindset of get the water away from the landscape as fast as possible. We built dikes and dams. We disconnected rivers from their floodplains. We filled in and disconnected wetlands. But again, in this instance, wood is probably one of the primary reasons why this stretch or lack of wood and structure is the reason why this looks the way it does. So this is a recent picture of a restoration work that was done by the tribe, working to address the lack of wood and structure in the Dungeness River. And in this case, we actively recreated a former side channel and filled it with wood. And the log jams that are in this case, because we can't get as big a wood as we would like, we depend on sort of groupings of wood, sometimes fastening the wood together into big engineered log jams. And these log jams have the impact of slowing the water down, moving it into the floodplains, into those side channels, creating a lot of habitat diversity and complexity, scouring pools, and breaking up those long areas where you might only see cobble and fast moving water. This is another image of our of a recent restoration project that the tribe was involved in, and S'Klallam County and many other partners were involved in, and it's a great example of a way that we have made changes to a landscape to reconnect the river to its floodplain so we can spread that water out, get it out onto the landscape, hopefully soak some of it in, retain it on the landscape, and have it interact with a lot more complexity. We also built some log jams that you can't see from this image, but it's a pretty amazing place to visit now. So I've kind of mentioned the stormwater mantra of spread it out, slow it down, sink it in. And I made this graphic go way too fast. One of the pictures that I often use in presentations to show the extreme of where we've modified streams is the LA River. And while I was working on this, my wife shared a video, which this is a graphic from where people are starting to restore areas of the LA River. And I kind of hope that they're ripping up the concrete while they're doing it too, but it gives me some hope that if people can imagine and start implementing changes to rivers that have been this badly changed, then we ought to be able to figure out how to restore our landscapes. So I'll thank Mr. John Gusman for his amazing work. This photo was collected by John for the Jamestown Tribe, and I'll just give you my final thoughts before we stop and have questions. So I enjoyed doing the research and putting this presentation together. I hope it didn't jump around too much. I hope it inspires you to better understand the landscape around you and around the world. And I hope that you will look at the landscapes you interact with differently. And I hope that you will look for ways to de-simplify the landscape around you. And thank you very much for this opportunity. And I'll stop sharing now.